Hey, welcome back to That Trucking Gospel. Today's show is going to be awesome. We have Will and Kendall with us from DAT, and we're going to look into the data analytics from the shipper's perspective and how we marry that up from an asset and asset-light perspective.
Long walls on the hood, and I'm still gripping wood, still tipping, baby, sitting sideways. Texas heat on the candy paint, in and out of county lanes, baby, I love to swing. Find me posted on the corner with a couple cold Coronas and some outlaws out today. When we started, we were sober, baby, it ain't even over. They gon' have to drag us out this place. Yeah, it's different down here.
All right, let's get right into it. I'm your host, Chris Bynum, and I got my right-hand man here, Robert Lopez Jr. So, Will and Kendall, thank you so much for joining That Trucking Gospel. I really look forward to our conversation today. But Kendall, jump over to you first. We know of each other, but we don't really know each other that well. We've worked together at a previous job, but just looking in your background, and I didn't know a lot of that about you, being active duty in the Air Force for 8 years, pursuing your doctorate, now spending most of your time on the shipper side. It's a pretty impressive resume. So with that, how'd you even end up in the transportation industry anyway?
Yeah, so I started out as right out of high school, enlisted into the Air Force as security forces. For civilian terms, it's very similar to a police officer. I primarily, my 8 years was working as the security side of it. So for the first 4 years, I was entrusted with guarding our nuclear weapons and involved in the transportation and logistics of moving those for the Air Force. So I did that for the first 4 years. So I started at ArcBest as an account manager. I had a small territory up here in northern Colorado where I was helping our small, medium-sized shippers coming in there as a consultative sales approach and helping to understand their supply chain and try to gain business for truckload and LTL brokerage was my first role. So I did that for 3 years, interacting closely with those customers, and then from there I was ready to move on to the next level, to the enterprise customers, where that's what I currently do at DAT. So work with our enterprise customers, integrating the data and analytics into their transportation program to help provide valuable, insights.
That's awesome. And, one thing that we say a lot on the show is if you get into the transportation industry, most of the time you have to be a real competitive person. And so when I was looking at Will and some of his backgrounds, talk about being, a competitive person. It's my understanding, Will, you had a little stint in the NFL, kind of dabbled into that a little bit. So if we talk about being competitive without even knowing you that well, I'm sure you're a competitive person. So kind of the same question, how'd you end up from where you were back then to where you are now?
Yeah, so I finished playing football at Eastern Washington. I was in mini camp with the Falcons, which is about 4 days, rookies only. It's kind of like a tryout is what it was. And I got done with mini camp and I thought for sure I'm going to get signed by the Falcons. So I went back home to the West Coast, waited on a call, was getting calls from CFL Arena. But my body, man, after playing offensive line in college, a lot of football games, close to 50 games, I was like, I don't know how much longer I can play. And my girlfriend at the time was a Georgia girl that played tennis at Eastern Washington. And she was getting into grad school, now wife. She was getting into grad school in Georgia. And Savannah was apparently the only place that she could get into grad school for her major. So I was like, okay, I'm out here on the West Coast. My girlfriend's just moved to the East Coast. I need to get to Georgia. So I saved up a little bit of money, a few $1,000, and came to Savannah. And I was like, okay, I need a job. So one of the places that I applied to was C.H. Robinson. That's where I was at for about 7 years. I had an option between C.H. Robinson and Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Those are the two offers I had when I moved to Georgia. And I was like, okay, so these guys at Enterprise got to wear a white shirt with a tie and got to clean cars in July in Savannah, Georgia. So I was like, there's no way that I'm doing that. There's absolutely no way that I'm doing that. So yeah, started at Robinson, started as an account manager. was in some carrier roles, carrier purchasing roles. And then I was like, okay, I want to be in control of my own pay, my own commission. I need to move over to sales. So quickly moved over to sales and worked with our customers there right up until about 2020. And then a good buddy of mine, shout out to Patriot Independent Insurance Partners. It's a commercial insurance agency. And he was like, hey, why don't you come over here and work with some of our owner operators, some of our fleets, help them with their insurance needs. So I got my insurance license, and I'll tell you what, that was probably the best time to be selling insurance, especially to owner operators. Everybody was trying to get their own authority, get out from being, leased under somebody else. So it was a good time, had fun with it, but ultimately decided that, insurance just wasn't for me. It can get a little repetitive. Just quoting trucks, looking at VIN numbers, driver's license numbers. And then I always was a user of DAT in my brokerage days. So was very familiar with the company and saw that they had a shipper segment. So I've been here for about the past 2.5 years now, working with our enterprise shipper customers, just like Kendall, helping them use data analytics to make the most informed supply chain decisions.
That's awesome. And one more thing too that I saw that you said, and it stuck to me just because I believe the same thing, is especially listening to you being on the West Coast, trying to get to Georgia. Where am I going to start my career? But you made a comment one time on a post that said, success at a high level is 80% mental and 20% physical. And I really appreciate that. And because with your background that you just said too, man, that was probably pretty tasking on the mental side in terms of where am I going to be? What job am I going to do? And then you ended up at C.H. Robinson. And man, I've said this 100 times. When you get into transportation, it's hard to get out. So even you got stuck. You got in and couldn't get out.
And the funny thing was too, is I remember, fresh out of college, doing my interview, and I sit behind someone and shadow them, right? And I'm looking at, 3 computer screens, and I'm looking at their load board and all of the different colors and different loads that are going different places and are at different stages. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to figure this out. Like, they asked me that, and I was like, I have no idea, because it seems like there's so many moving parts and it's so complex. And then started there, and it was, at that time in the office in Savannah, it was pretty much like, hey, you're shadowing. We're going to throw you into the fire, and you're going to learn by trial. So it definitely was a heavy mental piece versus physical.
In my spare time, I coach a little league baseball team, and that's one of the things I tell them all the time. Baseball's a failure sport. It's mental. Hall of Famers can, bat 300 and still make it to the Hall of Fame. And so I just thinking about that too, Kendall, and kind of coming back to you, just thinking about your active duty in the Air Force. And I've read a few little stories about your success there too. So talk about the mental side from kind of where you're at now too, just that, that piece in the Air Force until you were at today.
Yeah, certainly. So a little bit about me, right? So I grew up in a small town in southern Indiana called Vincennes. And I was the littlest of, I got 2 older brothers. So as you can imagine, just growing up, I had a competitive nature, just constantly having to fight with them to really get
Always
anything
fell
right. So again, I took that and moved into the Air Force with me, that drive, will, and determination, which, again, has helped me propel me to where I am today. But yeah, in the Air Force, I had a lot of responsibility at a really young age, and it just really helped develop me and create that discipline, which is, in sales, you got to have, as far as, discipline, the persistence to be successful. So, yeah, I definitely can contribute a lot of success from my experience in the Air Force.
Yeah, appreciate that. And so kind of to steer into where our conversation is going to go, we kind of talked about your past, your history, kind of how you got to where you're at. And what's funny to me is that's kind of the desk you sit in now. When you work with the shippers, you talk about that data analytic approach, looking at your historical data, so data is now one of the most sought after, I guess you can call it a commodity, especially in today's industry. So how did that, now with the experience we just talked about, how did that position for you to help shippers on the data analytical approach that they can make better informed decisions?
I mean, I think that, one of the things that a lot of shippers may not understand is we pick this up from being in the brokerage side, is just how freight is quoted. Like think about that. Like, when was the last time you had a conversation with a shipper on how you actually quote business? And I talk to them a lot about it all the time. And really, for the longest time, I would say that data, that brokers have been using data for a lot longer than shippers. And for the most case, because they have to do it to run their business, know what to pay a truck, know how much to charge a shipper. And really, the probably COVID and just rates going up so out of control, and logistics professionals having to really go to bat for, hey, why are your rates 30 to 40% higher? So it's like, okay, we need a data source, or we need to understand what's going on in the market so we can tell our leadership team exactly how we're doing. And then it's not just us that, just our company ABC where the rates are going off the charts. It's everyone. Because I mean, that was a tough conversation for a lot of shippers to have, especially with non-logistics people that maybe didn't understand or question the relationships that they had or the strategies that they had in place. So now it's just using data is just becoming more of a necessity, especially for larger shippers that are spending, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on transportation. They just really have to know to be able to communicate internally and with their partners, what their strategy is.
Just to add to all that, Will, is that, obviously we know prior to COVID, I think transportation, it still is in certain circumstances looked as more as a cost center. But again, once those rates started to climb during COVID, and of course that started to pique the C-suite's interest as far as, rates and starting to affect bottom line, almost for us in supply chain, it was kind of like our World Series. We finally, earned our seat at the table, and it became a huge talking point. And that's really helped propel us, moving forward. So when you think about integrating the analytics and what we provide at DAT, it's being able to provide that transparency into the market to help tell that story to the leadership on, here's how our supply chain, is operating right now when it comes to, cost and capacity and performance. And that's really kind of where we're starting to see a big play is the transparency between all three parties, where, like Will mentioned, previously brokers and carriers were very, they're very used to integrating data analytics, but for shippers, it's really starting to grow over the past, especially since COVID.
Yeah. So that brings up a question then. When I try to put my mind just on the shipper side, and we're talking about data analytics, what do they value the most, right? What KPIs do they value the most? We can sit here and probably talk about 10 different things that somebody could value, but from the seat you're in, what do you feel like from a shipper's perspective, do they value, especially working with a new broker or somebody that provides some type of transportation need for them?
Well, I'd say, even before we get into KPIs, it's just when you think about, especially like an enterprise shipper, when you think about how much time goes into a bid event, pre-bid, during the bid, post-bid, and then even, throughout their, quarterly business reviews that they might have with their partners. What's really important is that they understand exactly where they sit versus the market, based on their specific network and shipping characteristics. So that way they don't have to necessarily take all their lanes out to bid and rebid everything. Like, Chris, if you're doing a great job from a on-time pick, on-time delivery percentage, and your rates are right in line with market, or maybe they're even below, if they're not using a data source like DAT, they're not going to know that. So they might take your lanes out to bid and get a rate increase from you, or get a rate increase from someone else. Or you might say, hey, I thought we had a really great partnership going on, and I feel like I'm providing, very good competitive pricing. So without the data, they don't even know that. All they can go off of is the different rates that they receive. And then when you think about the lanes that they do take out to bid, or or maybe that are more above market, or maybe make sense to, and they're getting all of these rates back from all of these different providers that they invited to the bid, which rate do I choose? Because it's not always the cheapest, because the cheapest rate might be the cheapest for 2 months, but you might have wanted a commitment for a year. So it's just making sure that they have another piece to help them with the art and science of the providers that they're choosing and the rates that they're seeing that are going to be best for their network and sustainable. So I know that that wasn't an exact question, but or exact answer to your question, but I would say, on-time pickup, on-time delivery, and then how do your rates compare to market when we look at other shippers, we look at other similar characteristics, or maybe even other shippers in your industry.
That's actually, you answered it perfect in my eyes. So Kendall, let me ask you a little bit. Let me pivot off that a little bit then. So when it comes to on-time pick, on-time delivery, where does that cost kind of play into that? So when does the shipper then go a little bit deeper from the data analytics side about reliability, the flexibility somebody has, back to what you said earlier, just the communication and transparency from the shipper side. So you got all the stuff Will talked about, but when do they actually go a little bit deeper and say, everybody's doing good here, but how are they on, the flexibility, their communication, their transparency? How do they play that into what Will said as well?
Yeah, certainly. One way I think that's really important, obviously, to look at it from a shipper's perspective, when you're looking, and from a broker and carriers, how does, where am I at today as far as digitally, right? Am I using a TMS? Do I have, what systems and processes and procedures do we have in place currently? That, of course, like you mentioned, that the price is important, and being able to provide the service, but do you have the technology that can integrate and fit into my network as a shipper, that can make this, successful for not only, my team, but also, think about it from a accounts payable perspective and billing. I think those are the other key aspects, that other factors out there besides, price and service, that a shipper takes into account when it comes to choosing, who would be the best fit for my network. So from a broker and carrier standpoint, it's really important, it's kind of sales 101, to understand, where's the shipper at currently when it comes to digital, and then how can we provide value? Those little extra tidbits you're able to offer can really be the difference to whether you're awarded or not.
Hey, let's take a quick break for a minute to say thank you to our sponsor, Unity Brokering, for this show today. Unity Brokering focuses on optimizing your supply chains, leveraging the relationships with their customers and their carriers. If you would like to get in contact with Unity, please email dispatch@unitybrokering.com. Let's get back to the show. One thing too, I know that you're dying to get into, we kind of spent a little bit of time on that broker side of the business, just kind of thinking about brokers using a lot more, data a lot longer. And, Robert here likes to focus more on that asset side of the business, so kind of the same question, but now when you're sitting at a table, let's say they get it down to me as a broker, Robert as an asset-based carrier. Now what value do these shippers bring to the table, just to say, okay, now I have to make a decision between a broker, a third party, or direct to carrier, asset side of the business? How do those conversations look from y'all's table, and just how they make that determination?
Well, I would say, from an asset-based size, it's, we look at the, they think about the lanes, what does the frequency look like? What does the density look like? Is this a fit for your network as a carrier? Hey, if I can give you 3 loads a day, 3 days a week, going from point A to point B, how does that work in your network, right? Is that a perfect fit? Is that going to help you, position your assets? Is that a fair assumption? Versus, hey, maybe I only have, 80% of my freight is contract. It's dedicated. I understand the frequency, the volumes for the most part. Maybe you move that with an asset, right? Because that's what you want as an asset, is to be, predictable, to be able to plan your schedule. And then maybe that 20% that's not predictable, that's lower volume, that's a perfect fit for a broker. And that's really the way, and not to say that, consistent freight isn't a good fit for a broker, but when I think about really the difference between an asset and a broker, for a broker, it's the ability to, move freight whenever you need it, wherever it may need to go. Where with an asset, hey, trucks are covered today. We don't have any excess capacity. Sorry, can't help you. Unless maybe you have an asset arm or some, or a brokerage arm, or like several large asset based companies do. But really, I would say that's probably got to be the biggest factor when it comes to, okay, can I contract with an asset versus a broker? What makes more sense?
Yeah, and just to add to that, Will, I think, I think traditionally that the sentiment was, there's definitely a huge, within the market, shippers traditionally would look at, hey, you're either asset, or if you're a broker, we're not working with a broker. But moving forward, that's starting to change, because again, our brokers are starting to become much more sophisticated. They have the ability to work with asset-based providers and provide that, live drop that shippers are wanting. So again, it's still there, that stigma, I believe, as far as some shippers, right? They definitely are only wanting to work with asset, but brokers absolutely, in my eyes, have the same capability, whether it's a broker or an asset-based carrier, to provide the same value to the shipper customers.
And I think we'll get into the the transparency piece here in a minute too, but I want to add a little bit to that too. So when you just said something that perked my ears up about brokers being more sophisticated, being able to potentially drop equipment now. And we actually just had a conversation the other day with a different guest, and we were talking about how, there's the old, let's just call it the old school broker versus the new school broker, right? Like the old school broker didn't have great relationships with carriers. They maybe had a cradle to grave model. They're using a lot of the load boards like you guys provide, but then you have that other side that's looking for that capacity that may have 25 to 50 trucks to 100 trucks trailers, to allow that drop equipment. And they're kind of trying to finding a new niche where, as a broker, I can still go sit down next to an asset-based company and provide the same thing, maybe arguably with a little bit more flexibility. So with that, what you both just said, what type of tips would you kind of bring to let's say a new school broker that has that mentality, an asset-based company, and we're sitting at the same table? What type of tips could you give somebody like us to kind of help get that shipper to understand that this particular model might be the best fit for you, even though you have a mindset that I'm only going to use an asset?
What's tricky to me is that where a shipper says, I'm only going to use an asset. That's tricky to me, because, okay, what if the truck breaks down or can't make it, or the truck that was supposed to pick up, got delayed at the consignee, right? Got to do something, got to get some kind of equipment. But what I would say for a tip, and when I think about brokerage right now, and I think about when I was in brokerage, I feel like it is vital to really understand, and especially when you're starting out, start to look and specialize in some certain areas, right? Maybe you're a brokerage and you can go to a shipper and you can say, hey, I specialize in power only, moving drop trailers across the East Coast for retail and CPG customers. That's what we do, and that's what we're great at, and this is what our carrier relationships are built on. So being able to go in and talk to a shipper that way, like knowing, hey, this is what we specialize in, this is what we are great in, and this is what we do, versus, hey, we do everything. We can help you with everything we have. Because that's what they're getting. I asked all the time, how many calls are you getting? How many, LinkedIn DMs? 10, 20 a day, calls, emails. And a lot of brokers are saying those same things. They're saying, hey, what freight can I help you out with? How do I get set up? So just being, understanding the industry that you're targeting, getting a general idea of what, some of their needs could be. And I feel like the more specialized that you can be in your service, the bigger the differentiator versus the rest of the competition and everybody else out there.
Well, to rebound on the if a carrier has a truck that goes down, what do you do? So we've actually had the opposite in our market take place. Chris is running the brokering, Unity Brokering, and he'll have a truck go down, and I'll have to send my carrier trucks to go help him with his problems. Because if he would have called my company to run for him, my actual carrier-based company, then if that truck would have broken down, I would have sent another truck to recover it, because we have multiple trucks available to recover. When a broker style of shipping, typically that carrier, that owner op only has one truck. So, or two or three, or one's across the country here and over there. So we've actually experienced the opposite, that it's easier and it's more efficient, especially with local. And I would only think that it would be the same over the road as well, that we are able to send a asset to recover because right now we've run into situations to where Chris, he'll call me and say, "Hey, Bubba, what can you do this load for?" And I'll say, this is our price where we need to be. He's like, "Man, dude, I can give it to you like we're sister companies, but I can make more money if I go sell this load to someone else." And I tell him all the time, sell the load somewhere else.
Sell it. Yeah.
Then he's calling me saying, "Dude, the truck broke down. Can you get me a truck over here to tow this trailer back to the shipper to unload it, and so we can get it on a truck to California?" And I thought to myself, like, that creates so much strain on the customer. And luckily, he has a good relationship with the customer, so the customer is fine with unloading and loading. But that puts that costs them. It always is going to cost in order to work more, and to unload that cargo and to load it back up and to send it. We're thankful that the customer was understanding, but this has happened multiple times now.
Yep. What I love about that, though, and it kind of goes back to Will said, is what type of vision do you have as a broker, right? Get in that niche, right? He said, "I'm good at only power only." Find out what you're good at and be there. And I think you had a good vision of that a long time ago when you set up Unity, because your vision was, I am a flatbed, heavy haul, in-dump type asset-based company, and I need to marry that with a broker that's great at flatbed, in-dump, heavy haul. So it gives us that flexibility. I think that's what Will was talking about, is those companies that have the asset but have a brokering arm too. We just provided super flexibility to a customer, even though we had to use two different companies, but to the customer, they didn't know that happened behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. To them, they were still serviced. We still provided them a very high level. So I think it's a good thing and a bad thing, but I think the way that we marry those companies together is important, and it really allows the flexibility in sticking at what we're good at, right? Flatbed, in-dunk, heavy hauls.
What I've learned kind of is that, is the main shipment, like you said, 80% of what we're doing is going to go on an asset, but we're still using that 20% to broker, because it's here and there. It's not ever really consistent. And it allows you to be flexible with the market too, because the market comes up, it goes down. So when you're buying all this equipment, if you buy too much equipment and you're stuck with it and you can't, pay for the equipment, then it just creates a whole new problem. Our brokering married with our carrier company has allowed us to be able to wave a lot of different storms and provide a service for a customer that might have thought, all I need is assets. Or all I need is a broker, when in reality, they need both.
They need each other.
Yeah.
So let's kind of pivot our conversation into adapting to the market conditions, and that's a world you guys live in probably every single day. So let's jump in, just kind of some insight on the market conditions, and then let's kind of take this conversation we just had about when asset, when broker, you got to use them both, and how the market conditions could potentially change that conversation to a shipper. Because, if we have a ton of capacity and the asset-based companies are kind of, why would I not push an asset-based company compared to when the market flips? I need more flexibility, and that broker is going to be able to provide that to me. So, Kendall, if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about the market conditions as a whole right now, and kind of the data side you guys help, the value you bring, with working with those enterprise shippers.
Yeah, so as we know, right, over the past 24 months, we've been in what we call this inverted market, right? That's, looking at a national level where the spot markets are below the contract market. So the $1 million question out here, right, is when will this market flip when that spot rate goes back above the contract rate? And so something, shippers know, right, that the pendulum swings in the market between the brokers, shippers, and carriers. And currently, shippers are feeling the relief over the past 2 years due to the increase in rates for COVID and the demand for trucks. But right now, what we're doing at DAT is giving them the sentiment to prepare now, and they know it's going to flip eventually, right? And so this is where it's really key to, of course, having access to data to understand and get those insights on and first signals on when they think the market is going to kind of start to flip. But also it comes back to the whole partnership between the all three parties that are involved. So when you think about, right now, again, the shippers have the upper hand and are feeling that the cost savings, and brokers and carriers are kind of squeezed right now, but they know that's not going to last forever. And so right now, it's kind of one of those, hey, take care of me and I'll take care of you as we, move forward. So, really just being able to, from the broker and carrier side, is maintain that profitability. I think that's probably the biggest thing that, they need to focus on right now, is ensuring that and maintaining that. But also shippers know that the market will flip soon, and that they're preparing now as far as, looking at the data. And so that's one reason why the data is so, valuable to them.
Yeah, Will, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, when you think about shippers and logistics departments, it's strange because sometimes non-logistics leadership just thinks that rates should always be going down, right? Even they've been going down the last 2 years, and I still talk to shippers and I'm like, hey, what's senior leadership saying? They're saying, hey, they want rates to go down. And I'm like, man, you're at the bottom of the market. They can't go down much further. I mean, you're going to be putting people out of business. So that's where using the data to say, okay, here's where the market's at. Here's where other shippers are at. Here's where we're at. We can't go down any further. And then when you think about, okay, the market's going down and there's still pressure to bring rates down. Well, what's going to happen when rates start to go up, right? They're going to say, hey, hey, Chris, what are you doing here? Do we need to have a RFP event or, conversation with our carriers or brokers? And then at that point you can say, hey, look, here's the market position. Here's how we're doing. So maybe even if our rates go up 10%, maybe they went up 15% for the rest of the market, and we're still buying really well. So it gives them the tools and ability to drive their strategy and then communicate that upstream what's going on. Because without the data, it's just really hard. And even when we think about, like Kendall said, that the market's been inverted, just meaning spot rates are lower than contract rates. We noticed that the shippers that we work with historically, probably anywhere between 75 to 85% contract. When we go back over the last several years, pre-COVID, during COVID, and what we've seen is that a lot of the shippers utilize the spot market when rates were going like this during COVID. And even at the start of 22, on average, when they started to go down, we still see shippers leveraging the spot market where it makes sense in their network just to take advantage of the rates. So I think when being able to understand exactly and have a pulse on what spot and contract rates are doing can allow them to think about, what is our strategy moving forward? As the market changes, regardless of what it is, they can answer questions that the company might have about their specific position and strategy.
Yeah, and what's crazy about that is we've already kind of talked about how important just that data analytical approach is for both sides of the table, right? The carrier, the provider, and the shipper. So what I'm hearing you say is, since we don't really know, even though we're trying to predict when we're, going to come out of this all-time low, I think it shows more and more importance of both sides needing to be proactive, having great conversations, and build a better relationship than they have in the past. So, coming in through COVID, there's enough freight for everybody, and I'm just kind of getting it where I, get a carrier where I can get a carrier. But in this market, it shows you how important, especially from a broker's perspective, how those deep in the weeds conversations are better for you, the customer, and us, the provider. How important it is that we're talking about the what ifs. So when something happens, we can call an audible because at the end of the day, as a new age broker, I'm trying to make sure your customer's getting taken care of, right? If the speed to market's there, if I'm communicating like I'm supposed to, and the transparency's there, at the end of the day, the person that's winning is the end user, the end consumer, whoever needs that product, especially in our industry when we work with a lot of construction companies and they have, a superintendent sitting there just waiting on their product. That transparency piece becomes vital. So kind of pivot it from where the market's going to be, what relationship do you have with the customer and the shipper. So let's kind of dive into that transparency piece and why it's important, especially from a data analytical approach, because we can use all this data, but if you don't have that transparency that you're talking about, I think some of that stuff we talked about kind of breaks down, because that transparency, I feel like, is the glue to the data analytics that you guys are talking about. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I'd say, like obviously delivering to construction sites, and you got a crew there that's waiting to unload, and you got to be on time. That's something where maybe a customer uses data and they identify, hey, on these lanes, we're paying above market, but we would gladly do it every single day because we understand what a headache it is if the truck's not there, if there's an issue, if we can't get a hold of someone. So definitely on the specialized movements, that's why it's important for the shipper to be able to provide color, outside of just the data and analytics. And they may have several lanes where they pay above market, but they would, that's just fine because of the relationship, the dependability that they have with the carrier. It is worth paying above market. So, I could think of various instances where, that could come up, and definitely construction or heavy haul would be one of those.
It's crazy because even on our cups right here, we talk about one of our mottos here at That Trucking Gospel, Unity, and even Prosperity is inviting truth back to transportation. Because I feel like too, during COVID, I think brokers especially got a bad rap about, are you telling me the truth? Did that truck really break down? I could probably sit here and talk all day about what that transparency and communication looks from a shipper to a broker more specifically. But that's a fun conversation we have all the time about, if we get into one of those type of situations, we always ask ourselves, are we inviting truth back to transportation? Are we being fully honest and open?
Yep, that's the lens we want to look through. It's a difficult thing to do as a broker, though.
Well, because you're relying on somebody else that you potentially don't have a great relationship with to be the face of your business. You're taking a driver that you may have never met before.
Well, that's the thing. How do you know that if that owner operator or whoever it is that's running your freight is telling you the truth? So you could be telling the customer the truth that he gave you, but nonetheless, you don't really know because you don't know him. Right. When you're a carrier, I know all my drivers. I track all my trucks. We are able to get, we know if they have a blowout or they have something going on, and we have the assets there to go and get them back on the road quickly.
Yeah, so do y'all have any type of tools that you guys offer to help bring that visibility to shippers and help with this type of conversation?
Yeah, so I think of our market conditions index that shows, what the supply and demand looks like in any market. So that way you could, let's say I look at Houston outbound, I'll just throw that out there, and let's say that there's 16 loads per every truck. I probably have a good idea of why the truck broke down, right?
Right.
But I mean,
something paid better.
all jokes aside, right? That's not always the situation. And this, really takes guts and having a conversation, but being able to show them like, hey, look, there is a ton of competition in this outbound market. This guy says he couldn't deliver. We're going to go off that, but we're working extra hard to to get this recovered for you. It's very difficult right now. And, here's a screenshot of this map. If you need to share this internally or with the customer, please go ahead and let them know that, we're working through it with you. We're on your team. But that would be a way to give them some kind of insight that they might not have had. They just think, oh, the truck broke down, or they're not here to pick up at this certain time. So they may not understand how difficult it is for you to source a truck. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But just giving that kind of transparency piece, I don't think enough brokers necessarily do that, because they may not want to have that conversation or even bring it up.
Does Dad have their own assets?
Do we have assets?
Yeah.
No.
No, sir. No, we are a technology company, exclusively. So we don't move any freight. Just help it move. We just help it move, but we don't actually.
A
move
big
it.
part. Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Kendall.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, and just to add, yeah, so DAT, we're a neutral party within the broker, shipper, and carrier community. So kind of a high level, right? We currently bring in about 150 billion of actual freight transactions from data contributions from the broker, shipper, and carrier community. And so what we're doing is we're aggregating all this data and then giving it back on our platforms to provide transparency into the market.
One thing I love about what you guys bring to the table, because we talked about collaboration, trust, transparency, we know that's important. And you guys being a third party to the industry, right? It's kind of like inviting your friend into an argument, if you will, and you're saying, but this is why the broker can do this, but this is when the shipper needs this. And what that does is it kind of keeps everybody honest. So when we talk about that transparency piece, I'm not and this is some of the conversations I have with customers. I'm not telling you where the market's at. I'm not making that number up. It's coming from highly educated people at DAT that's saying, this is where the market's at. This is what you can do in this lane. This is why you struggle outbound Houston, because it's 17-1. And it allows that transparency piece to be, it's valid, right? It's not just me spitting it out there and saying, to make me sound better. It's allowing you to kind of marry that relationship up and backing it up with that data analytical approach.
Yeah. And think about too, like this scenario, like let's say we're thinking about that Houston outbound and you're like, hey, I need an extra 10% on the rate. The rates have just gone up. And they may look and they may think, if they don't have any data or insights, they may think, damn, 10%, I'm going to try to give that to someone else. But they might look and see, you know what? Chris was below market before, and he's right at market now, even with his increase, or maybe he's just a little bit above, but he does a great job. So that 10% increase doesn't really feel like a 10% increase. Maybe it feels like a 1% increase, right? And so without it, it's easier for them to make decisions when they understand why, and this is why the rates change. Because of this. And when you can give a third party, sample of proof, or they already have that in their back pocket, it just makes it so much easier. And it helps the relationship.
I got a question. Why wouldn't a shipper become their own broker, use all the tools that you guys give brokers, and work the market themselves with their own people? Like logistically inside? Why wouldn't a shipper just do that?
No, that's a fair question. Yeah, and some shippers will do that. So probably an easy way to explain it is, shippers, when they're thinking about their supply chain and how are they going to create their network, they make a decision between either make it or buy it. In other words, when I say make, I mean vertically integrate. And what you're mentioning, where hey, we're going to bring it in house, we're going to create our own private fleet. Have our own network and create our own mini brokerage arm, or they decide, and again, there's pros to that, right? You have more cost control, obviously you have more control over your own internal freight, but at the same time, some don't have that ability or want to deal with the headache that we deal with in transportation, and so they'll do the buy where they outsource it. So probably, one of the biggest things I'm starting to notice in the shipper when they're looking at procuring transportation is starting to look at almost a managed asset, or excuse me, a managed transportation provider. So outsourcing it to a company like Unity to say, hey, you guys are a good fit for us. Here's our network. You guys go and execute on the day to day and do that for us. So some shippers do that. It just depends, how, when they're looking at strategically which direction they'd like to go based on, what they feel fits their strategy.
Yeah, because I've found a lot of shippers that have actually done exactly what you're saying. Is they usually will say, "Hey, well, we're in the making of this business, not in trucking.
Exactly.
So we
Be
would
good
like
at
to
what you're
stay
good
in
at."
our own lane." But the more and more that I think about it, now that I have the brokering, I feel like the trucking side is the carrier side. The brokering is logistics. I know that it's there with trucking, and it's there merging trucking to, the actual shipper. But the shippers usually are doing a lot of the logistics themselves to sell the product. And just from my experience with Unity, I always tell Chris, I said, you have the easy job. Dude, our job is the hard job. Like, man, I'm telling you, I was up till 1 a.m. switching transmission oil and fixing and diagnosing an electronic problem on a dang Eaton that's brand new, and that's giving us heck, and paying $200,000 for the rig that is supposed to be on the road. Like, the worst thing I've seen Chris have to do, he's like, dang it, Alvis, you're reload for us. And it reloads in 5 seconds and he fixes his problem.
So, but what I think you're missing, and I think this is,
Tell me.
I think this is and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think this might be something in the industry that's missing is a lot of these authorities that have 1 to 5 trucks or 8, they don't have the means to go out and sell and have the admin team to be able to do a lot of the back office stuff. What they're good at is what you're talking about. I'm great at driving a truck. I'm great at maintenance my vehicle. I just love the fact that I'm just a road warrior, but they're not good at selling. They don't have the right personality. They can't afford to bring somebody in. So when it comes to the operational piece, you're spot on. We couldn't do our job without great companies like you. And some companies couldn't do their job without great brokers because it's kind of that sales force that they bring to the table, or that admin, that back end work. And then sometimes, that's where the headache is for a lot of those small companies. So it's not a fit for everybody, but I do feel like those companies that struggle with that's where they come in.
I got a question for Will. Will, you said that you were selling insurance and that a lot of people were switching from running with lease companies to running their own authority with brokering. What year was that?
That was like pretty much the start of COVID through about August of 21 when I started here. So almost 2 years that I was doing that. But it was, hey, we're seeing, rates do this, and drivers, they all talk. And hey, my buddy over here, he owns a trucking company. He says I can make, 30 grand this week or whatever it may be. But what I saw a lot of people, and you understand how much insurance is in a truck note. I mean, it's very expensive. And some of these drivers weren't necessarily they were good drivers, I'm sure, but they weren't necessarily good business people. Or they didn't understand exactly how much money they needed to have saved. So that way, if their truck broke down, or they were in a divorce or got sick and couldn't work for 3 weeks, they had some money saved up to handle all their expenses. So it was really tough just hearing the different stories and seeing what, went on. And that was even when rates were going up. When I left, rates hadn't really started to go down yet. And even thinking about the question that you asked about, shippers being their own brokers. I mean, the majority of the for-hire capacity is owner-operators. I mean, it really is. So when you think about, okay, a shipper setting up a truck and doing everything that they need to do to have them set up in their system and verified, it can be a much lengthier, and oftentimes is a significantly lengthier process than a broker setting up one of those carriers. And they may only use that. They may take all this time to set them up and may only use them once for a load, right? And then the other piece is the liability piece. So if I'm going to be handling my own brokerage, I need to make sure that I'm monitoring, carrier authority, carrier assurance, and having a responsible way to do that. So that way I don't get into a litigious situation if there were to get in an accident. And let's say they got in an accident and their authority just expired. It's all going right back to the shipper. All of that liability, the carrier maybe just goes out of business. They're going to go after that shipper. So I think that definitely the piece of having a broker to execute those shipments, handle billing, handle the insurance piece, helping to vet the carriers is definitely worth, whatever margin a broker would add to handle those services.
So let me ask a question of that, because it makes me thinking about, Will, what you're talking about pre-COVID, everybody leaving to get their own authority. So we saw a huge influx of new authorities, right? Especially in the middle of COVID. Does that drive kind of where we are in the market today in terms of these new authorities don't understand what the cost is to drive their truck, and everybody's just undercutting each other because they're trying to keep the truck moving? And so what happens is we see a slow tick of the market kind of deteriorate. Do you feel that plays a pretty big factor into that? Because from the desk I sit in, there's many times where I can tell, a particular carrier, man, you don't understand your cost if you're willing to do it for that, because I get to see the cost side of it on our asset side, right? So I kind of understand where that's at, and I'm like, man, how are you doing it for that? for that?
And I'm like, sell the trucks.
You probably wanted to sell those a couple years ago. Would have been
yeah, that'd have been a better time. I wasn't smart enough then.
Yeah. I think that had obviously played a role in it with all these new authorities. But then when you think about what was going on in COVID, people getting government printing money, people getting stimulus checks, going out and spending them, that had a huge part of it. Right. I mean, even when you think about like automotive, like, dealerships couldn't even keep a vehicle on the lot type of deal. Everyone was going out and buying a new house and buying new furniture and stuff to go into it, or just spending that money that was getting printed, which I definitely think fueled a lot of things, especially on a inflation side. But the sad part is that I think that a lot of drivers were led to believe that they could make a whole bunch of money, but they didn't really calculate all of the expenses and everything that goes into running your own authority and having your own business, where maybe they didn't have to do any of those things, when they were leased on to somebody.
And I feel like that hurt small carriers the most. Well, I don't feel like I know it. But then at the same time, with the brokering side, I've seen so much success. It's actually been quite amazing. It starts to intrigue me more and more, because I've always chose this more difficult path of owning the fleet and making sure that we could control the assets for the customer. And, when COVID hit, that was a real thing. I mean, my customer was relying on us like, hey, bring everything you got into this yard. We will do whatever it takes to make this happen, And the brokers were just sitting there twirling their thumbs like, dude, there is no capacity out there. They are chasing the money. So if you want this shipment gone, you might want to pay more money. When with our carrier side, what we didn't bump the rates up on them because the market had went up. We said, this is what it costs to do business now with a fuel surcharge. That's the only difference, and when fuel went down, the surcharge came off, and we're still doing business. So with owner operators, it's harder to control that for the customer, which is consistency.
And I think for me, and it kind of goes back to what Kendall was talking about earlier, when you talk about a broker's success compared to an asset-based carrier's success, it goes back to that transparency and understanding more of the data analytical approach, right? Of of using data to go to the customer to say, this is the why, this is the how, this is the when. Where on a carrier side, you kind of get sometimes comfortable that I own the assets and I get to pull all the levers and all. And sometimes I think now that people are taking a data analytical approach and saying, I need more flexibility, I need more communication, I need more transparency, I need to understand where the market's at, not just because you have a truck in my market today. I think if a broker can be true to themselves, have great relationships, be more transparent, and lean on data for those selling, that's where it's hard for a customer to say, I only want to use an asset. Because and for me, I sit down a little bit different, right? I want to give you both. I'm going to give you, just tell me you need a shipment to move, and I'm going to marry up what's the best, because kind of what Will was talking about earlier, that's the reason you don't have a transportation department. You're paying somebody to make those decisions for you. When does an asset-based company best fit this model? When does a broker, and in some case, it might be asset 85% of the time, but then we got to lean on our brokering firm. So, I really appreciate you guys bringing the, just kind of the attitude of the collaboration, the transparency, you guys being third party, that analytical approach, because I think we have these conversations all the time. So I think it even puts a little wrinkle in our conversations when we hear other people kind of talk about the same things we talk about.
Is the data based off of the 85% of like the broker trucks and what they're running the freight for?
So we have data on what shippers are paying for spot and contract. We have data on what brokers are paying carriers in the spot market. So like even for you guys having a conversation about new business or a shipper, you could get on the same page and where Chris is like, hey, this is where rates are. This is where rates are forecasted to go. If we want to win this business together, like let's talk through this and have a plan on how we can sell this to the customer versus, Chris just saying, hey, you got to do it for less. And a carrier might be thinking, hey, this broker is just trying to make all the money, but it's them having, that transparency piece to say, hey, this is why I got to be here if we want to win this business. And work together on it.
Yeah, and I feel like I should and have to say this every show. I will always argue that the carrier that I do business with is a little more important than the customer because of the fact of he's the face of my business as a broker. He's the face of the customer that's representing me. And it's the idea of if he's taken care of and he's happy, so is the customer and so is the end user. So to Will's point, this is where the market's at. This is where it's going to be transparency with the carrier, transparency with the customer. Everybody wins, and that's what we're all asking for is that sustainable business, not just transactional. And I think what I hear from you, Will, is if you bring that transparency and collaboration on both sides as a broker, you're going to get that. And then when you tie in the asset side of the business that brings that transparency as well, everybody has to be kind of true to themselves and kind of understand this is where it's at. This is what the customer's willing to pay, and this is who's willing to do it. Well, fellas, I cannot say thank you enough. Your time is very valuable to us. We appreciate the conversation today.
Well, appreciate it, guys.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate
Thanks for
it.
having us.
Thank you guys for tuning into That Trucking Gospel. New episodes every Tuesday. You can follow us on all social media platforms. Till next time.